Hello, welcome to another exciting episode of Up and Coming Christianity. I'm your host, Pastor Evan Cookman, coming to you recorded live from the overground bunker in my location. Well, it's good to see you all again. I'm thrilled to be uploading again. And if you are curious what took so long, I am in the middle of a house remodel. Then I got sick. And while I still have a little bit of it, it was bad. And I don't think anyone wants to listen to somebody sniffle and mucus their way through a video podcast. That sounds terrible. So, runny nose is gone. New dishwasher is in. I'm ready to get down to business. So the episode that we're going to be covering today is called, Is Christianity Reasonable? Now, I want to admit to you in a little bit, this is a bit of a clickbaity title because the answer is yes, no, yes. So let's dive into it. So first, the reason why I want to say is that the reason why I say there's a yes, no, yes is because the idea of reasonable is actually really subjective. By subjective, what I mean is art is subjective, mathematics is objective. Your feelings don't change that 2 plus 2 equals 4, but two people can look at a sunset and have two totally different reactions to it. So the reaction to the sunset is subjective. The sunset itself is objective. Are you following me so far? So what this means is that when I say that is Christianity reasonable, and that reasonable is subjective, let me explain a little bit. There was a time in human history where it was completely reasonable to believe that it was okay to own another human being. We called it slavery, and it was the dominant position held by the world for the majority of our history. So all of society and all people around the world, if you said, hey, is it reasonable to own human beings? They're like, yeah. You think it's unreasonable? That's crazy. There was a time in human history where it was completely reasonable to believe that sacrificing animals would keep the spirits from attacking you. Now, there are still people in the world where this is a completely reasonable way of life. There's a time in human history where it is completely reasonable to believe that the earth is the center of the universe and everything else revolves around it. And so these are just a few examples of times or things that are completely reasonable to a lot of people that now we think is just cuckoo bananas. So, is it reasonable? Well, reasonable is subjective. But that doesn't mean that there isn't absolute truth. And that's where, okay, like I said, you look at the sunset and you have a subjective reaction to it, doesn't change that the sunset exists. So there is still objective truth. And I believe I fall on the old philosophical notion that I can define truth as a justified, true belief. Just because reason is subjective doesn't negate absolute truth. So here's what I mean. Islam and Hinduism cannot be both true at the same time because they negate one another. Unless there's some sort of a bigger pantheon that we don't really understand or know. Because even for people who know Islam well enough to say that, well, I mean, Islam can exist under the Hindu belief, and they coexist because people follow different pathways and it's all path of progress and they'll just reincarnate later. But even then, that doesn't say that Islam is true and Hinduism is true. It's Hinduism saying Hinduism is true whether those who practice Islam follow it or not. And the idea of the larger pantheon where everything's true all at the same time would mean that universalists are the ones who generally are right, but they're more or less just reverent agnostic who can't tell you like what truth is, or they just say there's a supreme being or beings or the spiritual world, and it all just works out. But even then, that's not saying that Islam is true. That's saying that universalism is true. So you see, these competing worldviews can't coexist as truth claims. But that doesn't mean that the people who hold to these beliefs can't coexist. I'm a firm proponent that war is sick and that as a species we should fight war, not wars. So the whole coexist thing, even though I loathe the bumper sticker, I love the sentiment. So, all truth claims can't all be right if they contradict each other. So that means there is something that is true. So, whether we know this absolute truth or not does not negate that it is. So, let's talk about ultimately all humanity is living on some kind of faith. And I can feel people already starting to get a little bit uncomfortable with this, especially if you're secular humanist and you're like, no, my whole worldview is based on logic and reason and evidence. To which I would say, I disagree with you, and we're going to get into a little bit of that. But we're all living under some kind of faith that our worldview is coherent and correct. And every human being has a worldview. We all believe something. Because a worldview is really nothing more than your systems of belief. So everybody believes something. Even if they believe in nothing, believing in nothing is still a belief. All of those beliefs gel into one another and they form a worldview. Some worldviews are more coherent than others. Like, let's say that you are a secular humanist and you also believe in astrology. That's some cognitive dissonance, because by definition, secular humanism is 100% naturalism, and there's no room for the metaphysical, and astrology is purely metaphysical. So if you believe both of those things at the same time, you have some cognitive dissonance, but somehow you have resolved it in your mind, and you've decided that they can coexist in your worldview. We all have to take that we live under a system of belief, and that we all take it on faith that our system of belief is correct. Because at the end of the day, what are you trying to prove, and can you prove it? Beyond a shadow of a doubt, can you prove it? And one of my favorite examples of this is I can't, as a Christian, recommend that you type into YouTube season 8, episode 10 of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where Mac rants about truth is a liar sometimes. And the gang starts, except for Dennis, believing that there's reason to doubt evolution. So I can't, as a Christian, say you should go watch it, but it's hilarious, and it's where my mind went when I was thinking about we all take it on faith that our worldview is correct. And as I start exploring this idea, I want to focus on the secular humanist camp for a minute. Now, the secular humanist camp is the people who believe that we were formed from purely natural processes, that there is no divine hand, there's no metaphysical world, and everything can be explained through natural processes. So these are going to be the people who certainly believe in evolution, human progress, and that, like Carl Sagan famously said, the cosmos are all that have been and ever will be. And the purpose of this video isn't to try and debunk all these things or just knock on them, as much as what I want to say is that even the secular humanist position that in the United States is going to be my primary audience are going to have to confront that they're still taking their worldview on faith and not just pure evidence and reason like they think. I'm not trying to pick on these people as much as I believe that out of everyone who could watch this video, they're going to be the first ones who raise their hand and say, not me, I don't live by faith, I live by reason. Well, let's start here. Terence McKenna, who is an extremely interesting figure who studied at UC Berkeley and like the field of like psychedelics, really funky guy. But he has this quote that I love, and it's this: "All of modern science is predicated on this. Afford me one great miracle, and I can explain the rest." And I believe that he was correct, because what is that miracle? The Big Bang. And the thing with the Big Bang that is incredible to me is that no one knows where the Big Bang started. I don't mean when, I mean how. And what I mean by that is what was before the Big Bang, and science can't tell us that. They can't figure it out. All the theories I read are people who are like, well, I mean, if we just ignore the laws of physics for a moment, and it's all just postulations, there's no evidence or proof. There's no evidence or proof in a multiverse. It's just an idea. So prior to the Big Bang, there was nothing. Nothing. And I can tell you what nothing isn't. Everything. Because even the vacuum of space is something. A vacuum devoid of space is something. But nothing, by definition, is nothing. And how could nothing somehow create everything? And the only way that you can get around this is to start telling yourself that everything is infinite. It has no beginning and it has no end. It's always been and it always will be, and it may go through cycles in the way that one day when the universe burns out, it'll somehow collapse back in on itself and the whole process will start over again, in which case it's just infinite. Otherwise, you need a great miracle to understand how nothing created everything. And even then, I spent way too much time on reading a Reddit thread, because I was looking at, who Terence McKenna in the quote, and it was amazing to me the amount of people who were arguing over the quote. And not like Christians and atheists. I mean just like atheists, because there were atheists who were like, what do you mean? Like, we don't believe in miracles. And, well, how can you say that we'll never figure it out? And one guy's like, because we'll never figure it out. And like, how dare you say that? Like, humanity can figure anything out. People are already working on it. And then I read like a BBC article where it was like, oh, guys trying to figure it out. It's like, oh, okay. By and large, secular humanism rests on a miracle that they say they can't understand. So then also, this is another thing I've noticed, is that by and large, secular humanists tend to overlook their own biases. Yeah, their own biases. Because they love to say, oh no, it's all evidence, it's pure evidence. But they don't really look that deep into where the evidence came from. At first blush, this seems counterintuitive. Like I said, isn't secular humanism based entirely on reason and evidence? I think not. It started as a philosophy around 1610 BC, so 1610 before Christ, or Common Era, with Greek philosophers, and if I butcher these names, forgive me, but Anaxagoras, Democritus, Anaximander, Anaximenes, and Empedocles. And these were Greeks who said, you know what? The Greek pantheon just seems bizarre and crazy, and like we're not going in on it. And so they were like the first atheist philosophers who are the ones who started the idea of natural observation, that you can only look and observe at what already exists. That they say you cannot look and say, Magic Man in the sky did it. You have to see it through the lens of nature. So if you think that this started as a bunch of people who were looking at evidence and then said, oh, look at what we found and figured out through this evidence, it didn't. It started as a philosophy. And even though this is at 610 BC, it wound up really coming back in the 16th, 17th century, and even into the 18th century through the Enlightenment era. And what really is on these beliefs is that there's only nature, Everything is on an upward trajectory. Human intellect is the highest order of thought. And so this has been propagated by philosophers like Spinoza, Voltaire, Descartes, Kant, Hegel, and these are just a few guys who all were publishing before Origin of the Species. And they're philosophers. And they're the ones who are saying, we don't believe that God exists, and we don't think he can exist, and here's why. And they were publishing their philosophies almost 100 years before Origin of the Species. So even Google admits that Darwin published Origin of the Species with limited evidence. Now, then they're quick to say, oh, but he was certainly vindicated as the years went on. How convenient. But what it leads me into is to say, for the secular humanists who claim, oh no, we are purely on evidence and reason, it didn't start with evidence. It started with an idea. It started with a belief. And then the evidence came. And let's talk about that evidence, right? It starts with the idea that we find these bones and then we go, oh, this is clearly the missing link. We have found ancestral man. And let's talk about some of them that are my personal favorites. Piltdown Man. Piltdown Man was established as a human link until about 50 years after it was published, when someone was looking at it and went, hey, wait a minute. And they discovered that it was a jawbone where they broke the jawbones off to prove it didn't fit into the skull and then airbrushed it to make it look old. It was a forgery and a fraud. But for 50 years, it was considered to be science fact. Neanderthals have gone through a grip of revisions since they were discovered, meaning they went from these knuckle-dragging, club-bashing lowbrows to these sophisticated hunter-gatherers who were using tools, and they'd just gone through all these revisions. And then Peking Man, this is one of my favorites, was discovered on the strength of 2 teeth. Where then they found a 3rd tooth and went, we've discovered something important. And then they went into the cave and they found a bunch of skulls and a bunch of hands. And they said, oh, wow, this is obviously human ancestors, even though it was kind of figured out later that it was a bunch of cannibals who were eating these people and headhunters and then moved on. And the evolutionists say it was higher human life forms cannibalizing lower human life forms, but still. You found 3 teeth and said, my God, we found something incredible. We have to investigate it. And then, oh, we found the missing link. Here's another good one, is the Nebraska Man. So the Nebraska Man was a pure hoax, all fabricated on the grounds of a singular pig's molar. I want you to consider that. Nebraska Man made it into the journals as the missing link. They created a whole narrative around how Nebraska Man was one of our common ancestors, and the whole thing was fabricated around a tooth. And people believed it. And even then, before I was a real heavy Christian, I was reading a National Geographic in the locker room when I was at the gym about the discovery of Lucy. And it was big news at the time. And about pages after pages we have found this amazing common ancestor of mankind. And then I looked at the bones they found. It was like the top of a skull, half a pelvis, some broken legs, and a wrist. And then it got filled in, and then they put skin over it, and then they said, all hail our ancestral mother. And as I was looking into it, like I was watching a YouTube video from the guy who discovered it, and it was on National Geographic and all these things, as he's going on the circuit promoting it, the amount of people who loved calling this thing mother, I thought it was very strange, because even if evolution is true, I refuse to call those lower life forms mother, because we are the conquering species. Our species conquered, overcame, and ate those other ones to become the champions that we are today. So yeah, I'm not calling it mom. I'm calling it the past. But myself personally, I just think it was some sort of an ape or a chimpanzee, and that I don't believe it has any ancestry. And then you see full fossils of like cat-sized lemurs that then are claimed, oh, this is obviously a common ancestor. And so this is the evidence of evolution. And so I just want to ask the question, is it evidence or is it confirmation bias? If you discovered the bones and you weren't looking for the evidence of evolution, would you have deduced that you had found a common ancestor to humanity? And that's the question. And if you think, oh, of course it's evidence, and how could you even question that? Remember, members of the LDS Church are convinced that Joseph Smith was God's chief prophet and certainly couldn't have been a con man, no matter what evidence you show them. So, a powerful reminder that we are all living on faith that the evidence that we perceive in our worldview is correct, making our worldview reasonable. And I'm not bringing up all these points to try and just prove evolution. That's not my field of knowledge. I got my degree in practical biblical theology. Although I ran all these things down for the first couple of years I was a Christian because I was an adult convert. And I was like, I've heard all these claims that science has completely disproven God. Is there any reality to that? If there is, I'd better figure that out because I don't want to give my life to a bunch of nonsense. And so I ran it down. I've been reading books on it. I still watch debates. An excellent debate that I highly recommend is watching William Lane Craig debate Christopher Hitchens on the origin of life. It's good. Very rarely do you see Christopher Hitchens sweat. I've watched a lot of debates where Hitchens clearly won, but not that time. What I've learned and how I reached the conclusion that at this point, none of the evidence I've seen offers sufficient grounds to prove to me that Christianity is an ancient myth and fables and has no grounding or bearing in absolute, justifiable, true belief. None of the evidence that I have said has led me to the conclusion that Christianity is wrong. I bring up these examples to say that every human is operating on the faith that their worldview is correct. From the animists to the tribal religions, to the pagans, to the atheists, to the theists, to the universalists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, Catholics, Protestants, we all are operating under the belief that our ideas are the ones that are correct. And we're doing it through faith. I'm not going to change my mind no matter how much evidence you show me. I'm an American. I'm dug in. But everyone has a reason to believe what they believe supports their worldview, but that just doesn't mean that it's absolute truth. So why do I believe Christianity is the truth and a completely reasonable worldview? Remember I said yes, no, yes earlier. And here's my reasons. 1, Christianity answers all the questions. It's the most coherent and complete worldview that I have found, including secular humanism. So secular humanists claim that Christianity is intellectually weak because they call it God of the gaps. Anything that we don't know, they say that we as Christians say, oh, God did it, and that is intellectually lazy. Well, I say that they have science of the gaps where they say we might not know now, but we will know someday. And so both competing worldviews believe there's an answer. One just says we already know, and the other says we'll figure it out someday. But Christianity, for me, answers all of the questions with no unexplainable gaps or unreasonable contradictions. I don't have to believe that in Christianity there are two competing truths that are contradictory. It's coherent. It's singular. I don't have cognitive dissonance. And it explains the big questions. Who are we? What are we? Why are we? And where are we going? It gives us identity is our humanity. It tells us who we are and what we are and why we are. It answers all the major philosophical questions. Here's another one for me, is that it's ancient. Because Genesis goes back to the first of humanity. And then after the first of humanity, then God furthers the unfolding of his revelation through Abram, and then it gets further revelation through Moses, and then further revelation through David, and then further revelation through Jesus Christ, which leads us into the era that we are now. And throughout all of it, it's coherent. It's one message that is unfolded over generations. There's no one figure in Christianity who explained it all. Like, take Islam, for example. I reject Islam because there was a time when Islam was not. And then you had a guy who hit the scene and said, you're all wrong. You've all been wrong, except for an ancient time that no one can remember. And I'm right. And then I'm going to write this one holy book that everybody has to worship. And God help you if you add to it, because I'm the only chief prophet there ever has been or ever will be. Like, that's Islam. So I'm like, I don't know, man. That seems like God can't control his business, like, how could, this is another reason why I reject the LDS faith, is they say that there was a good 1800 years or something where the people just got away from God, and there he is up in heavenly kingdom going gosh, they're just not, they got away from me. Well, I'll wait a few hundred years and then I'll send him a prophet. That never happens in the history of Christianity. It's coherent. And so it's ancient, which means there was never a time in history where God wasn't interacting with humanity. And that's something that I love about Christianity, is that no prophet fundamentally changed the religion. And then this is one that's really unpopular, but it works for me, and that Christianity became a dominant world religion. So what do I mean by a dominant world religion? Well, what I mean is this. I had some friends who were big into Odin. They were Odinists. And they used to whine to me about how Christianity went in and ransacked their culture. And I said, if Odin is supposed to be this great warrior god who's running Valhalla and wants all these warriors to be the greatest of themselves. This is one of the things the Odinists love, is that Odin doesn't command our worship. He just wants us to be the best we can be. And it's like a bunch of Christian monks overcame and dominated your culture. Odin couldn't save you, and he didn't save you. Now, this is not popular in America right now, okay? But the fact that Christianity overcame the majority of the world religions has to give it some kind of weight and credibility. I think about even places in communist China where they sought to stamp out all religion. They stamped out their own religion, but they couldn't stamp out Christianity. One of the fastest growing Christian churches in the world is in communist China right now. Another one of the fastest growing Christian churches in the world is happening in Iran. So these places are trying so hard to crush it, and all they're doing is watering it and feeding it. So Christianity, the fact that it can't be overcome and dominated, gives it credibility and weight in my eyes. Although that's a very unpopular opinion. I also think that God is an incomprehensible being. God is beyond what you can conceive. And for me, that gives him weight and credibility. So if I look at any of the other gods, they're all so human. The Greek pantheon, they're a funky bunch. And I bring them up because I was reading a Reddit thread where someone was saying that they love mythology because the Greek gods were also human. They had jealousy and lust and murder and rape and all these things, and that gave them a credibility because they were relatable. And though someone then said, did you just call the Christian God a Mary Sue? And it cracks me up because I'm like, yeah, those gods are pathetic. I don't want to worship a rapist. I don't want to worship a murderer. Like, I'm not into that. So the fact that God is wholly other and incomprehensible. Here's another one. In the LDS, Heavenly Father was once a man in flesh and blood, just like me and the other guys watching, who then ascended to his place of celestial Heavenly Father. And then he had a whole bunch of spirit babies and he pumped them out and down to the planet they went. So one day, if we work the path, we can go and be like Heavenly Father, not worship Heavenly Father. We will get our own planets to rule. That's so human. Allah is just the most powerful human times a million. But God's incomprehensible. The fact that the Trinity, the Godhead, we can't wrap our heads around it, makes the Christian God wholly other. He's not like us. And that gives him credibility to me. Because I remember Carl Sagan explaining fourth dimensional objects through mathematics. Like he drew up a tesseract and he's like, this is just like a shadow. Because in a fourth dimension, we can't comprehend what a tesseract would look like because we can't conceive the fourth dimension. Well, okay, well, that means God's like ninth dimension. And the fourth dimension to him is Tinker Toys while he's playing around with Hadron Colliders. And the fact that this being that could create all things with its will and is aware of the thoughts of billions of humanity all at once and all creation, that means that it is beyond our comprehension. And that's something that I'm okay calling God. Here's another one, is that the Bible over and over and over has proven itself to be completely reliable and trustworthy. I did a previous video on it, and if you want to know more about my thoughts on the Bible, you can watch it. And bottom line, the Bible's reliable and trustworthy to me. And I've lived it. And the more I live it, the better my life gets. So I'll live it harder. Which also brings me to my last point. And it's my experience with Christianity has proven to me that it's good. I acknowledge that not everyone has had that experience with Christianity. Church hurt's real. I have met people who have been abused by Christian leaders. I know women who have been molested by pastors. I know people who were hit with Bibles. And it breaks my heart. But it doesn't mean that Christianity is not true. It just means that those people who were wounded by sick, sinful humans. And I don't know, I just need to throw that out there. Like for me to say Christianity is good, and if you're watching that and you have a heart full of hurt, that's real because people hurt you in the name of Christ, I want you to know those were people, not God. And God's still good, and he's still holy, and he's still loving, and he's still there. I just had to throw that out there. And it's not like I've never been burned by the church either. It's just I've been around the church long enough to know, like, hey, bunch of humans in there. I have wrestled with my faith for years. Years I have wrestled with it. And that's because by and large, I'm an adult convert. I spent the majority of my adult life not believing in God. And that's because I wanted to drink beer, do drugs, and have sex with strange women. And God wasn't about that. So I wasn't about God. And I was smoking a cigarette out in the night sky one night when I was a teenager, and I said, no, I don't believe in God. And I just moved on, and I lived how I wanted to live, and I did what I wanted to do. And then I had a spiritual awakening, and I became a Christian, and I spent years trying to investigate whether or not this is true, because I am not going to give my life over to a bunch of baloney. Don't think that it's never crossed my mind that all of Christianity is just one big made-up story. Don't think I've never considered that it's all made up and it's an ancient hoax and that the Graf Wellhausen theory might be true. I can't prove it. I have to take it on faith. And that's with a yes, no, yes. Is Christianity reasonable? Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe the secular humanists are right. Maybe they're not. Because they can't prove their position any more than I can prove mine. And anyone who claims otherwise is not being honest. Can I prove that Moses wrote the Pentateuch? I can't prove it. But no one can prove he didn't. Can I prove that Jesus Christ was died on the cross and resurrected on the third day? I can't prove it, but you can't prove that he didn't. Is Christianity reasonable? I think so. And I wanted to ask just a couple questions as I end it, and the first is this. What would it take to get you to change your mind? I get asked this a lot, and here's my answer, and this is real. I'm not being facetious or cute. It's real. If extraterrestrials landed on Earth and explained everything, I would reevaluate my belief system because I would have an outside influence that then could make some pretty big confirmations, and I would be forced to reevaluate my position. And I'm not talking about the phony baloney like fifth dimension beings that like I was watching a documentary out. There's a guy saying that you can meditate your way into alien presence. And I'm like, yeah, okay, that sounds like what a con. I'm talking about like Independence Day. Aliens have arrived and no one can dispute it. And in that vein, what would it take for you to get, or for me to change my mind? What would it take for you to change your mind if you don't believe in God? To quote Frank Turek, if Christianity were true, would you be a Christian? If it were true, would you be a Christian? And I want you to answer that real honest in your heart. Because I've seen a lot of people who say, no, I wouldn't because I don't like Christianity. Hey, at least they're being honest. See, we all have these deep beliefs that at first blush seem to be a coherent worldview. All of us, all of humanity. But not all worldviews can be true. So it's on us to push past our embedded beliefs, to lay them all out and investigate them. T estin aletheia. Quid est veritas? What is truth? And to me, it's Christianity. I think it's a justified, true belief. And I believe it to be the most complete and reasonable of all the worldviews. All right. That's it. Thank you. Good to be back, and I'll see you all next week. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you. May the Lord lift up his countenance towards you and give you peace.